America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at The Republican Workers' Party by F.H. Buckley. This is a 2018 book, much more recent than I prefer to do, but sometimes I like to do the newer ones just to keep up with what people are saying in the current era. I know last time I said I was going to do another William James essay this episode, but that got put on hold. That was a lie. I will do some more William James essays in some upcoming episodes, but I just needed a break for a moment, and I wanted to do this one. This book is interesting, but also a little frustrating. The author here, Buckley, was involved in the Trump campaign in some form. He talks about it a little bit in here. I don't want to get into that part of it. I want to look specifically in here at Chapter 8, almost exclusively, when he talks about nationalism, and a little bit in Chapter 7. I don't want to talk about his experiences with the Trump campaign. It is interesting. He kind of talks about what brought Trump to the scene. It's an interesting book, but there are parts here I agree with and parts I disagree with, which is usually the case. He kind of describes himself at times as a progressive conservative or something along those lines. He even, I believe at one point, refers to himself as a conservative Marxist. I would not do that if I were him. That's not a good way to paint yourself, or, by proxy Trump, if you're part of the Trump campaign. I mean, conservatives, Republicans should probably keep people who self-identify as Marxists off their teams. But this is not like a bad book. There's parts here that are interesting. He does some things that I like, the kind of patchwork, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, syncretic, almost eclectic type of approach. He's got a little bit of that sort of style, which I can appreciate. Like all my episodes, I'm going to read some sections here and have a few comments about them. Like I said, one part from Chapter 7, then the rest is Chapter 8. The part from Chapter 7 that I want to read, Chapter 7 is called Two-Dimensional Man. And this section is called How the Republican Workers' Party Occupies the Sweet Spot. Here he says, quote, "In a naive view of American politics, voter preferences and political parties can all be ranged along a left-right axis defined by economics. Every voter and every politician must be pegged somewhere along the line, from socialism and pure paternalism at the extreme left to unrestrained free markets and free choices at the extreme right. This makes public policy a bloodless, technical exercise in which non-economic preferences are suppressed. Yet those questions influence how we vote as much as or more than purely economic ones. This is something Herbert Marcuse recognized in One-Dimensional Man, the book that became the New Left's Bible in the 1960s. Before then, the older Marxists had seen economics as the single driving force behind human history, but Soviet communism had proven repressive. And 60s leftists weren't going to take their inspiration from the aged Leonid Brezhnev or Alexei Kosygin. Instead, they turned to Marcuse, who told them that socialism had hit a brick wall, that capitalism had been able to resist the logic of Marxist dialectics by constraining economic options along a one-dimensional parameter. Consumers were free to choose, but only after their personal desires and political choices had been manipulated by mass culture and ideology, in the manner suggested by John Kenneth Galbraith. For progressives, said Marcuse, the way out was an authentic liberalization in which people recognized their bondage to an irrational technical and economic system and sought a transformative change along a second dimension of choice. In place of one-dimensional economism, Marcuse proposed a vision of expanded possibilities that recognized everyone's essential dignity. Before Trump, the Republican establishment had also seen politics along a single left-right economic divide. Their Democratic opponents were socialists, while they were the right-wing growth party. That was what Romney saw as his ticket to victory. In his 59-point plan full of sensible free market ideas, a manifesto for Republican insiders, which no one but them ever read. And we know where that got them. In the 2012 election, the Republican one-dimensional man was left in the dustbin. In Trump's America, there's obviously more going on than a single economic axis could capture. Along a different axis, voters can be divided according to their views about a variety of other issues: nationalism versus globalism, immigration restrictions versus open borders, religion versus irreligion, and a classless versus a class society. Grouping all such current concerns together, our politics can be portrayed along two axes, economic and non-economic, according to the preferences of two-dimensional men who vote for two-dimensional parties. That's how Lee Drutman at the Voter Survey Group saw things in a fascinating analysis of voter preferences conducted after the 2016 general election. The questionnaire asked voters to identify both whom they voted for and how they felt about various economic and social issues. Drutman then mapped the responses in a diagram: red dots for a Trump voter, blue for Hillary, yellow for other candidates. Economic preferences were portrayed on the horizontal axis, left wing on the left, right wing on the right. Social preferences were shown on the vertical axis, left wing at the bottom, right wing at the top. The diagram divided voters into four quadrants. The 44.6% who fell into the lower left quadrant were strongly left-wing on both economic and social issues. Some of them voted for the Green Party candidate, Jill Stein, while some even voted for Trump, but more than 4/5 voted for Hillary Clinton. Next, the Antipodean upper right quadrant was composed of conservatives who were both socially and economically right-wing. They constituted 22.7% of all voters, and 9/10 of them voted for Trump. A minuscule 3.8% of the voters were libertarians in the lower right quadrant, socially left-wing and economically right-wing, and they split their votes evenly between Trump and Clinton. Finally, 28.9% of the voters occupied the upper left quadrant, economically left-wing but socially right-wing. Drutman called them populists, but I prefer the label that Trump himself gave them, the Republican Workers' Party. They went 3-1 for Trump. End quote. Okay, so he's talking about a couple of interesting points here. Basically, he says that for a long time, people have looked at politics along this left-right axis, and they put economics as the primary component of this. Now, I don't know if this is most people, but this is certainly a certain class of political analyst, let's say, or political thinker, who looks at the entire political operation as a side effect of economics, a manifestation of two different economic points of view: the left-wing free market capitalist point of view, the right-wing free market capitalist point of view, and the left-wing Marxist, socialist, collectivist economic point of view. And he says that's clearly inadequate. Romney tried to run on that, on a right-wing capitalist approach, and failed. And he says that Marcuse wrote about this, but he clearly wasn't writing from a right-wing perspective, but Marcuse was writing from a left-wing perspective that, at the time, at least that he was writing, the left-wing political ideas weren't doing well. And he said we need to look at things along another axis. So he fast forward to the future. He says there's this recent Drutman guy who did these surveys and plotted things along two axes, one of them being sort of an economic one and one of them being a social one. He really says that everything non-economic was grouped into one category and bundled into a second axis, which has all these social components, which themselves are classified in a way that he doesn't really specify. He just says sort of socially left-wing, socially right-wing, and doesn't explain it any more than that, but essentially conservative and progressive division. And so now we have a two-dimensional political grid. And I'm sure everybody has seen this before. It gets memed a lot with a sort of socialist, capitalist axis on one and a socially conservative, socially progressive axis on the other. And you get different, it's used in different memes. Anyway, he says that this guy doing these surveys found that hardly anybody was in the bottom right, which is really the more libertarian, more socially liberal, but economically conservative, kind of more capitalist, but whatever, this libertarian sort of quadrant that he describes it as. And he says not really many people are there. Almost half of the people he places into this, or Drutman places into this bottom left quadrant, which is left on social issues and left on economic issues, practically half the country. And the rest of the country is split between the two top sections, economically right, economically left. So he says, well, the economically right, socially right quadrant, of course, they're Republicans. But this other one, the economically left, socially right, top left quadrant, he says these guys went mostly 3-1 for Trump. He's basically saying this is a sort of an untapped market. This leaves a huge number of people, the more those people are catered to, with this left-wing economic policy. And we have to be careful with that sort of thing, because I think that the correct approach to economics is more of a right-wing approach, and we can't give in to nonsensical Marxist economics, socialist economics, too much, just in pursuit of votes. It may be that most of the people are just wrong, but it's certainly something to think about. And he says that this group is called populists by Drutman, but he doesn't like to call them populists. He calls them the Republican Workers' Party, which is the name of the book, which he says is the name that Trump gave them. I'm not sure where he gets that, but the Republican Workers' Party is his concept for a Republican Party that embraces some of these left-wing economic ideas in order to build a sort of coalition that can win elections. So that's it. Now, two dimensions is still not a lot. You might say one dimension is not enough. Now we have two. Two is really not enough either. There's a lot of different ways of looking at things, and that second non-economic category could probably be split up into a whole host of economic of different orientations, different axes that could be. You might be able to identify a sort of cluster of people that have a certain set of beliefs about this, and the other, constituting, a whole array of positions. That's not quite the same collection of array of positions as some other cultural cluster of people. And they might not be identified super clearly. The fewer axes you have, the less clearly you can identify these clusters of people. Anyway, let's keep moving. The next chapter, when he talks about nationalism, he says the following, quote, "We need to examine American nationalism more closely and see how it differs from populism, with which it's often confused. Populism was one of the nastiest political movements of American history. It was inevitable, therefore, that Trump would be called a populist. You should never give your opponents the right to label you, but even some of Trump's supporters have called themselves populists. They should know better. Trump is a nationalist, not a populist. It's true that Trump, like most populists, thinks that tariff walls to keep foreign goods out of the country might help American workers. But then Abraham Lincoln and William McKinley thought so too, and they weren't populists. It is also true that, like most populists, Trump championed an underclass unjustly held back by an aristocracy of wealth. But then Karl Marx and Eugene V. Debs, the Socialist Union leader, thought they were doing the same thing. They weren't populists. We must also admit that Trump, like most populists, decried the influence of money in politics, but then so did Hillary Clinton and Liz Warren, and nobody called them populists. Here's what the accusation of populism really means. It's a smear, meant to link one to people such as Pitchfork Ben Tillman, one of the vilest people in American political history. Tillman was the governor of South Carolina from 1890 to 1894 and served as the state's representative in the U.S. Senate for the next 23 years. He was undoubtedly a populist, the Platonic form of populism. He was also the man who invented Jim Crow laws in his state, a person who defended lynch mobs and boasted of killing black Americans. That's why the charge of populism is a dog whistle meant to tar someone as a racist. End quote. This, I think, is this is like how he opens this nationalism chapter. He's like really opposed to the word populist or to like accepting populism. I don't know. I think that this sounds kind of absurd. I'm sure that nobody thinks when they hear of the word populist, like, oh, that makes me think of old Pitchfork Ben Tillman. That South Carolina fellow from 1890 to 1894 from the U.S. Senate for the next 30 years. Nobody knows who that guy is. That's not what people think when they think populist. He says you shouldn't let your enemies define you, but then that's exactly what he does, is he like lets leftists define what populists are. And then says, well, run away from that. You're not that. I think that the word populist is fine. Moreover, he gives in to like, I don't know. Let's keep moving. So he says here, quote, 240 years ago, America spoke itself into existence as a nation with a Declaration of Independence that proclaimed the inalienable rights of individuals and the just foundation of government. That foundation, Lincoln told us, was a government of, by, and for the people. And what he meant was a government of, by, and for the American people. Lincoln always put America first. So too did John Adams. When he presented his credentials as the first American ambassador to Great Britain, George III observed that Adams was not thought to be especially fond of France. I must vow to your majesty, replied Adams, I have no attachments but to my own country. To which the king replied, an honest man will never have any other. And nationalism was what Donald Trump pledged in his inaugural address. From this day forward, he announced, a new vision will govern our land. From this moment on, it's going to be America first. That bothered people. And one reason is because there are different kinds of nationalism, some less innocent than others. Among the former is ethnic nationalism, which promotes a special allegiance to one's own racial or ethnic group and excludes others. In America, this might be alt-right white nationalism or the black nationalism of the Black Lives Matter movement, Ta-Nehisi Coates and Louis Farrakhan. The ethnic nationalist may assert a need to correct historical injustices, but the demand for payback can mask a more primal racial hatred. When I lived in Quebec, a separatist government enacted mean-spirited language laws to administer a psychological drubbing to the province's Anglophones. I resented it, and I wasn't going to have much use either for the ethnic nationalists in America's alt-right, nor would Trump. In his inaugural address, he said, "It is time to remember that old wisdom our soldiers will never forget, that whether we are black or brown or white, we all bleed the same red blood of patriots, we all enjoy the same glorious freedoms, and we all salute the great American flag." Then there is cultural nationalism, where what matters is assimilation into a common culture. There's nothing wrong with celebrating American writers and artists as Americans, but for some people, cultural nationalism is also a way of excluding others. And they might have been encouraged when Trump said in Warsaw that the West will never, ever be broken. Our values will prevail, our people will thrive, and our civilization will triumph. And did that throw fat into the fire? Was Trump saying that non-Western Americans were somehow less than American? Our people write symphonies, said Trump. Did that mean that you had to appreciate high culture with a European hue to count as one of our people? At the Atlantic, Peter Beinart detected a thinly veiled bigotry behind the speech. Trump was talking about Christendom, he said, a particular religious civilization that must protect itself from outsiders. Monty Python told us that nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, but the Atlantic expects it daily. Then, inevitably, Charles Blow of the New York Times said on CNN that talk of culture is a dog whistle for racists. If we're supposed to assimilate to an American culture, he asked, are you saying that you need to abandon your ethnicity and become more like, the kind of white America that I'm envisioning? Blow wondered whether cultural nationalism would privilege Anglo-Americans, whether conservatives were employing the idea of assimilation as a weapon against America's minorities. Some alt-right types do just that, but they miss the point. Culture is not the continuation of politics by other means, and culture can be profoundly unifying. Our music and art enable us to share transcendent emotional experiences with people who may differ from us in various ways. W.E.B. Du Bois recognized this truth. I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. Across the color line I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. Western culture itself is immensely diverse and absorptive. If British culture excluded foreign elements, for example, its music would have no George Friedrich Handel, its literature no Joseph Conrad, its philosophy no Ludwig Wittgenstein. Going back to our Roman heritage, what is that? Asks Remy Bragg, but an appropriation of Greek philosophy and a Jewish-based religion. The Western culture of which Trump spoke derives its strength from its willingness to borrow from other cultures, and this is especially true of American culture. There isn't much room for white nationalism in American culture. For alongside baseball and apple pie, it includes Langston Hughes and Amy Tan, Tex-Mex food and Norah Jones. You can be an American if you don't enjoy them, but you might be a wee bit more American if you do. The cultural nationalist is right to say that being an American is more than subscribing to the principles in the Declaration of Independence. A lot of people in other countries do too, and they're not American. Becoming an American requires a few more things: American citizenship and a love for American institutions that aren't owned by a single race. There is an American culture, and it's not a white culture or a black culture or a Mexican culture. That's why the American who sincerely hates American multiculturalism is something less than an American. End quote. So, he describes in here a couple of different types of nationalisms. He says basically that nationalism is good, but Trump's vision of America First and the whole concept of America First and nationalism bothers people because nationalism's not always good. There's some of them that are not as good and some of them that are better. And he describes two types of nationalisms here: ethnic nationalism and cultural nationalism. He goes on later to describe another nationalism. I'll read from that section in just a moment, but dealing with these first two, he describes the first as sort of like the worst, the least innocent, ethnic nationalism, and then cultural nationalism, which is multi-ethnic but expects a single kind of cultural assimilation, is not as bad as the ethnic nationalism, which identifies a particular, presumably a particular culture and a particular race at the core of nationhood. But he says neither of them are really all that great. That there's parts of American culture that are like different aspects of it, and to tie us to, like Trump tying us to the West, or tying us to Christendom, or tying us to, symphonies and sort of European cultural traditions, is like this method of excluding other cultures. And so there's this multicultural aspect, especially to America. He says, like, it's the thing in the West, but especially in America, we've got this multicultural thing going on. And even he says there is an American culture. It's not a white culture or a black culture or a Mexican culture. That's why the American who sincerely hates American multiculturalism is something less than an American. So you can be born in America. You can have ethnic roots in America. You can have historic heritage, lineage that goes back for generations in this country. You can participate in it fully, but if you hate American multiculturalism, then you are something less than an American. Which I find really, because he's talking about a distinction between ethnic nationalism, but having a sort of cultural nationalism is just still too much, because it excludes people. But it's like his whole premise is excludes people who aren't as into his vision of what nationalism is. There's like less than an American. You're less American if you don't buy into the multicultural vision of America. There's always room for an exclusionary policy. There's always a way to exclude people. That will never go away. We'll always maintain some sort of a friend-enemy distinction, like we saw in Carl Schmitt. And ultimately, this guy finds quite a few ways to point out and say, that's not good, that's not really American, that's not what America's about, this is America. And it's a set of ideas, and it's the ideas of the people who agree with him, which is usually something similar. So the next section is Liberal Nationalism. And this is like the type of nationalism that he prefers. And this is a slightly longer section. But I want to talk about this. I want to read this and talk about it a little bit. What he thinks is sort of a better or the best vision of what nationalism ought to be. He says, quote, "The focal point for nationalist and patriotic sentiments is the sense that America has a special mission to promote liberty, as promised by the Declaration of Independence and guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. These have assumed the status of what the historian Pauline Maier called American scripture. The Republican Workers' Party is nationalist and rejects the anti-nationalist globalism, the open borders of the Democrats, and of yesterday's Republican Party. It also embraces a distinctly American kind of nationalism. Unlike the reactionary paleocons or the leftist Frankfurt School, the Republican Workers' Party glories in the Enlightenment beliefs of our founders. These it accepts as its own. It is faithful to the principles of the Declaration because they are American, and not only because they're pretty good ideas. American nationalism is liberal nationalism, and nothing like the ethnic tribalism of Johann Gottfried Herder or his Nazi epigones. Instead, it rests on a sense of solidarity with all Americans, rather than with the Democrats' narrower identity groups. While it's possible to be a German white nationalist, an American white nationalist is a contradiction in terms." Trump's critics were quick to detect the whiff of fascism in his nationalism. It doesn't take a history degree to recognize how hysterical this is, but if historical perspective were needed, Jean-Francois Revel provided it when he observed that, while the dark night of fascism is always said to be descending on America, somehow it lands only in Europe. And that's because constitutional liberties are the icon of American nationhood, and constitutive of our identities as Americans. For Americans, as Americans, illiberalism is self-defeating, and when Americans have been illiberal in the past, in time they've been seen to be un-American. People wouldn't worry so much about American nationalism if they recognized that it is necessarily liberal. That became clear in the Supreme Court's Texas versus Johnson decision to protect political protests that take the form of flag burning. The Stars and Stripes is an icon of nationhood, but not so fundamental as the constitutional right of free speech. When courts uphold, on free speech grounds, the rights of protesters to burn an American flag, they're not trivializing a national symbol. Instead, they prefer an abstract fundamental icon, the Bill of Rights, to a less central symbol, the flag. If there is a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, ruled the court, it is that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea itself offensive or disagreeable. At the same time, nationalism can't be employed to divide one group of Americans from another. American nationalism must be egalitarian, and a nationalism that makes second-class citizens of some Americans, based upon their race or sexual orientation, is profoundly anti-American. But neither should the Bill of Rights, an icon of American nationalism, be employed to marginalize people on the basis of their political or religious beliefs. In other words, not every political issue should be turned into a constitutional one, in a way that only divides us further. In politics, there are always winners and losers, and there is nothing particularly dishonorable about being on the losing side of a political debate. In constitutional debates, however, the loser's argument is judged to be fundamentally illegitimate. Because constitutional rights are at the heart of our national identity, taking the wrong side on a constitutional question comes to be seen as un-American. The baker who refuses to provide a wedding cake for a gay couple is not just labeled a bigot and dragged into court, which is bad enough. He'll also be branded un-American if he's judged to have trenched on constitutionally protected rights. Today, people sneer at the House Un-American Affairs Committee of the 1950s, at the very idea of calling people un-American for their politics. Yet this lives on in litigation meant to show that the many millions of religiously conservative Americans are less than American, even if they do no harm to others. And that's unnecessarily divisive. Nationalism also has something to say about fraternity, which might seem a little odd to an American. It's the French, we think, who have liberty, equality, fraternity, not the Americans, and yet American nationalists, too, must distinguish between strangers and brothers, non-citizens and citizens. They must feel a special sense of fraternity with their fellow citizens. That's the logic of nationalism. Otherwise, it's a hollow fraud. The nationalist will prefer citizens over non-citizens. He'll deny to non-citizens rights and privileges he grants to fellow citizens. But what he denies the non-citizen must then be paid for by what he would give to his fellow citizens. If the nationalist wants to reduce immigration, for example, he must argue that this will benefit citizens. By contrast, the anti-nationalist can treat citizens and non-citizens alike. If he is a progressive, he might want to offer the same generous welfare rights to each. If he is a libertarian, he might prefer to deny welfare rights to both groups. Nationalism, on the other hand, is about differences, about preferences for fellow citizens. Along with his love of liberty and equality, the American nationalist must prize fraternity. Fraternity is the cement of society. More than a common belief in some grand theory of politics, it's the sense of fraternity that lets us accept the results of an election that our side lost fairly, rather than join in resistance or talk about secession. It is what permits us to accept economic inequalities that are justly derived and to oppose those that stem from unjust advantages." End quote. Okay, so there's a bunch in here, and I just want to take a moment to point out a few spots. So right off the bat, he says the focal point for nationalist and patriotic sentiments is the sense that America has a special mission to promote liberty. As promised by the Declaration of Independence and guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, they have assumed the status of what the historian Pauline Maier called the American Scripture. So this is more of the same America is an idea kind of approach. that most American nationalists, I think, have begun to grow fed up with. Because we are like a people. We are a specific group of people. Like, let's just take the people who live here now. And imagine we don't import anybody. We just have the people who are currently citizens. And that group has some sort of ethnic makeup. It's like 60-something% white, I think, and some percent such and such and so on and so forth for the remainder. It has a particular makeup of people. And it's not just any people, it's a particular people. It's not just white people, but it's white people who are mostly of these particular countries, who speak mostly English. If nobody else were to come in and a generation were to pass, you'd find that the next generation carried those same qualities. It's not gonna next generation become like 70% Malaysian, absent immigration. It has a quality to it. It has a certain characteristics to it. We're not going to be Russian speaking within 1 year absent external influence of some dramatic sort. We have certain qualities to us, and those qualities are passed down from one generation to the next. And so this sort of makeup that we have now, if immigration were not an issue, would to some greater or lesser extent maintain itself as that particular makeup in a consistent way over time. And that makeup has an ethnic component, it has a cultural component, it has language components, it has mythological components, religious components, value-based components. It has all sorts of things. And that's what constitutes the nation. The nation is the collection of people and their attributes that they pass down over time. A generation later, a couple of generations later, it's not the same people, but it's the same nation. Something is carried on from one to the next. And it's not just the paperwork that some previous generations had all signed onto that binds them all together over the course of generations. It's the fact that one generation is the offspring of the previous generation living in the same place. They're part of a shared nation. And the idea that our nationhood is like attached to these ideas, okay, the ideas are a component of our nation, but they're not the primary component of our nation. But yeah, he's got a lot of this American nationalism must be like this, it must be like that, it must be egalitarian. It must be a free speech-based nationalism. I could see how these things are part of the American tradition in some form or another. Equality before the law. There's some components of liberalism, let's say, that are bound up in our laws and are bound up in our Constitution, bound up in our culture as well. But they're not the foundation. And this idea that people get branded un-American. But he does make reference to fraternity and the necessity of fraternity. But one thing that caught my eye was when he says the nationalist will prefer fellow citizens over non-citizens. Yes, of course. He says he'll deny to non-citizens rights and privileges he grants to fellow citizens. Yes, of course. He says, but what he denies to the non-citizen must then be paid for by what he would give to his fellow citizens. He says if the nationalist wants to reduce immigration, for example, he must argue that this will benefit citizens. That's kind of a nonsensical. What he denies the non-citizen must be paid for by what he would give to his fellow citizens. So, in other words, if the non-citizen brings something and the nationalist wants to say no, he has to provide that for the people or explain how it would be provided by his policy in such a manner that would offset whatever benefit would otherwise be provided. Kind of brings it back to a sort of contractual, like, it's not all about benefits. Like, if a people say they don't want to have immigration above a certain level, there's nobody that they have to explain it to. They might want to say, they might believe that they should justify their belief to their other fellow citizens in order to get them to support their position. But ultimately, a people has the capacity and the right to exclude immigrants and immigration without having to justify it on economic terms or on some sort of utilitarian terms. But, I think that comes down to just the fear that people have of simple exertion of power, or at least the fear that people have on the right of simply exerting their will. People on the left don't seem to fear exerting their will in the same way. But those were the parts I wanted to read, where he talks about nationalism, and I think that he makes a mistake when he discounts both the ethnic and the cultural aspects of nationalism. American nationalism may be liberal in some aspects because of various parts of our history and the fact that our foundation is bound up with some of the ideas of the Enlightenment, and it's influenced our culture. But it's not exclusively liberal. And it's not the case that someone who is a liberal and believes in the American ideals and believes in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and lives in India is more American, or even could be considered American in any way, in contrast to someone who's lives in this country, whose ancestors perhaps fought in the Revolutionary War and believes in the exact opposite of liberalism, who believes in monarchy, authoritarian monarchy, that person is un-American. There's always a connection that a person has through their blood to their nation that's not erased by their ideas. And I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time. Goodbye.